What if a killer walked among you? By day a factory worker, by night a predator hunting the streets? He savaged mothers and daughters alike, drank their blood for pleasure, and left a city paralyzed by fear. This was not just another crime story. It was a nightmare that blurred the line between myth and reality. In this video, we dive into the twisted mind of Peter Kürten, the vampire of Düsseldorf. Born on May 26, 1883 in Mulheim am Rhein, Germany, Peter Kürten grew up in a sparse one-room apartment, along with his siblings and parents, both of whom were alcoholics. His father in particular was a violent drunkard, and there was a long history of mental illness on the paternal side of the family line. When intoxicated, Peter's father often forced his wife and children to assemble before him before ordering his wife to strip naked and have sex with him as his children watched. For a child already surrounded by violence, this environment planted the seeds of cruelty and detachment that would later define his crimes. Peter later said that if they hadn't been married, it would have been our word. His father was considered irascible and self-possessed, ineffective at controlling his sexual urges, and was later jailed for 3 years for repeatedly R-wording his eldest daughter, who was 13 years old. Shortly thereafter, Peter's mother obtained a separation order. In 1911, she remarried and relocated to Düsseldorf. In 1888, 5-year-old Peter attempted to drown one of his playmates. 4 years later, he befriended a dog catcher who lived in the same building as his family. This man, a degenerate, showed the young boy how to masturbate and torture dogs. Far from being repulsed by such behavior, the young Peter became an active participant and a strong bond developed between them. Modern criminologists would later point to this moment as the fusing of Peter's sexuality with violence, a dangerous combination that would haunt his entire life. Being the eldest, Peter was the target of much of his father's physical abuse and frequently refused to return home from school as a result. Although he had been a good student, he later recalled that his academic performance suffered due to the extensive physical violence he endured. From an early age, Peter often ran away from home for periods of time, ranging from days to weeks. Much of the time he spent on the streets was in the company of petty criminals and social misfits. Via these acquaintances, he was introduced to various forms of petty crime, which he initially committed as a means of feeding and clothing himself when living on the streets. But unlike other boys who stole to survive, Peter discovered something darker. Crime was not just necessity, it was pleasure. Peter later confessed to committing his first murders at the age of 9 while playing on a raft in the Rhine. He said he pushed a school friend into the water, knowing he could not swim. When the boy's friend dived in to rescue him, he, too, was pushed under the raft and held down until he suffocated. These deaths were investigated and ruled as accidental by authorities. This early escape from justice emboldened him, teaching Peter that death could be hidden in plain sight. At the age of 13, Peter became acquainted with a girl his age, and the two formed a relationship. Although she allowed him to undress and fondle her, she resisted any and all attempts he made to engage in sexual intercourse. In frustration, he would resort to bestiality to relieve his sexual urges. He soon discovered that his most powerful sexual pleasures came when he repeatedly stabbed a sheep as he had intercourse, an act that he began acting out with increasing frequency. The sight of blood became inseparable from desire, a twisted connection that would later horrify the world. In 1897, 16-year-old Peter left school and, at his father's insistence, obtained employment as an apprentice molder. However, this lasted for 2 years before he stole 300 gold marks from his employer before taking all the money he could find in his household. He relocated to Koblenz, where he met and began living with a woman twice his age. According to Peter, this woman, an ill-treated masochistic prostitute, willingly submitted to every form of sexual perversion he demanded of her. He was soon to receive the first of 27 prison sentences that would take up 24 years of his life. He was charged with breaking and entering and theft and sentenced to 1 month's imprisonment. Released from prison in August 1899, he quickly reverted to a life of petty crime. However, this first period of confinement left the young Peter bitter and angry at the conditions of the penal system. He later said that, "I do not condemn those sentences in themselves, but I do condemn the way they are carried out on young people." During his imprisonment, he developed a fantasy world whereby he could achieve orgasm by imagining violent sexual acts. This became an obsession, so much so that he would deliberately break minor prison rules so that he could be sentenced to solitary confinement. Solitary confinement, meant to punish him, instead became his sanctuary, a place where his fantasies grew sharper, darker, and more consuming. Shortly after his release from prison, he decided to enact the dangerous fantasies he had developed while in prison. In his later confessions, he told police he picked up an 18-year-old girl at the Eliestrasse and persuaded her to accompany him to the Hofgarten. There, he claimed, the two engaged in sexual intercourse. During the act, he strangled her into unconsciousness with his bare hands before leaving the scene, believing her to be dead. With no records from the time to back up Peter's claims, it is believed that if this attack did indeed take place, the victim likely survived the assault. According to Peter, by committing this act, he had finally proven to himself that the most pleasurable gratification could only be achieved by taking a life. Most worryingly for the people of Düsseldorf, his desire for revenge against the injustices he perceived to have suffered would now be the catalyst for his murderous spree that saw him enact his sadistic fantasies as an act of retribution against the very society that saw him imprisoned. Shortly thereafter, in 1900, Peter was arrested for fraud. He would be rearrested later the same year on the same charge, although on this second occasion, charges pertaining to his 1899 Düsseldorf thefts, plus the attempted murder of a girl with a firearm, were added to the indictment. Consequently, he was sentenced to 4 years' imprisonment in October 1900. He served this sentence in Derendorf, a borough of Düsseldorf. Released in the summer of 1904, Peter was drafted into the Imperial German Army. He was deployed to the city of Metz in Lorraine to serve in the 98th Infantry Regiment, although he soon deserted. That autumn, he began committing acts of arson, which he would discreetly watch from a distance as emergency services attempted to extinguish the fires. The majority of these fires were in barns and haylofts, and Peter would admit to police he had committed around 24 acts of arson upon his arrest that New Year's Eve. He also freely admitted these fires had been committed both for his sexual excitement and in the hope of burning sleeping tramps alive. As a result of his desertion, Peter was tried by the military court and convicted of desertion in addition to multiple counts of arson, robbery, and attempted robbery, and was subsequently imprisoned from 1905 to 1913. He served his sentence in Münster, with much of his time spent in solitary confinement for repeated instances of insubordination. He would later claim to investigators and psychologists this period of incarceration was that in which he first encountered severe forms of discipline, and as such, the erotic fantasies he had earlier developed while incarcerated in Derendorf expanded to include graphic fantasies of his striking out at society and killing masses of people. These fantasies became ever more paramount and overbearing in his mind, and Peter later claimed that he derived the sort of pleasures from these visions that other people would get from thinking about a naked woman, adding that he occasionally spontaneously ejaculated while preoccupied with such thoughts. The first murder Peter definitively committed occurred on May 25, 1913. During the course of a burglary at a tavern in Mulheim am Rhein, he encountered a 9-year-old girl named Christine Klein asleep in her bed. This is how Peter recounted the murder of Christine Klein at his trial. It was on May 25, 1913. I had been stealing, specializing in public bars or inns where the owners lived on the floor above. In a room above an inn at Kolmulheim, I discovered a child of about 10 asleep. Her head was facing the window. I seized it with my left hand and strangled her for about a minute and a half. The child woke up and struggled but lost consciousness. I had a small but sharp pocket knife with me, and I held the child's head and cut her throat. I heard the blood spurt and drip on the mat beside the bed. It spurted in an arch right over my hand. The whole thing lasted about 3 minutes. Then I locked the door again and went back home to Düsseldorf. Christine was just 9 years old. For her family, grief was eternal. For Peter, it was the beginning of a reign of terror. The following day, Peter specifically returned to Cologne to drink in a tavern located directly opposite that in which he had murdered Klein, so that he could listen to the locals' reactions to the child's murder. He later recollected to investigators that he derived an extreme sense of gratification from the general disgust, repulsion, and outrage he had heard in the patrons' conversations. This grotesque ritual showed how Peter's crimes were not only physical acts, but psychological obsessions he relived again and again. Moreover, in the weeks following Klein's funeral, Peter occasionally traveled to Mulheim am Rhein to visit the child's grave, adding that when he handled the soil covering the grave, he spontaneously ejaculated. 2 months later, again in the course of committing a burglary with the aid of a skeleton key, Peter broke into a home in Düsseldorf. Discovering a 17-year-old girl named Gertrude Franken asleep in her bed, he manually strangled the girl, ejaculating at the sight of blood spouting from her mouth, before leaving the crime scene. Peter managed to escape from the scene of this attempted murder undetected. Just days after the attempted murder of Franken, on July 14th, Peter was arrested for a series of arson attacks and burglaries. He was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment, although his repeated instances of insubordination, while imprisoned, saw his incarceration extended by a further 2 years. He served this sentence in a military prison in the town of Brieg. Prison was meant to break him, but instead it hardened him further. Each punishment only deepened his resentment, and each day in confinement gave him more time to refine the fantasies that would later spill into reality. Released in April 1921, Peter relocated to Altenburg, where he initially lived with his sister. Through his sister, Peter became acquainted with a woman 3 years his senior named Auguste Scharf, a sweet shop proprietor and former prostitute who had previously been convicted of shooting her fiancé to death, and to whom Peter initially posed as a former prisoner of war. 2 years later, Peter and Scharf married, and although the couple regularly engaged in sex, Peter later admitted he could consummate his marriage only by fantasizing about committing violence against another individual, and that, after their wedding night, he engaged in intercourse with his wife only at her invitation. Even in marriage, Peter's desires were never rooted in intimacy. They were rooted in cruelty. What looked like stability on the surface was, in truth, a mask hiding his escalating darkness. During this time of apparent stability in his life, Peter gained permanent work in a factory and became active in trade union circles. Although he seemed to forge no friendships, besides that of his wife, Peter spent the next 4 years in relative peace, and for all intents and purposes, seemed to be living a perfectly normal and respectable life. But this calm was only an illusion. Beneath the facade of respectability, the fantasies never left him. They only grew stronger. In 1925, he returned with Scharf to Düsseldorf, where he soon began affairs with a servant girl named Tita and a housemaid named Mek. Both women were frequently subjected to partial strangulation when they submitted to intercourse, with Tita once being informed by Peter, "That's what love means." When his wife discovered his infidelity, Tita reported Peter to police, claiming he had seduced her. Mek alleged Peter had rewarded her. The more serious charge was later dropped, although Tita's allegations were pursued, thus earning Peter an 8-month prison sentence for attempted seduction and threatening behavior. Peter served 6 months of this sentence, with his early release being upon the condition he left Düsseldorf. He later successfully appealed the ruling that he relocate from the city. Even when caught, Peter always found a way back. The system that tried to contain him only delayed the inevitable. On February 3, 1929, Peter stalked a middle-aged woman named Apollonia Kuhn. Waiting until Kuhn was shielded from the view of potential witnesses by bushes, Peter pounced upon her, grabbing her by the lapels of her coat and shouting the words, "No row, don't scream," before dragging her into nearby undergrowth, where he proceeded to stab her 24 times with a sharpened pair of scissors. Although many of the blows were inflicted so deeply that the scissors struck her bones, Kuhn survived her injuries. Her survival was nothing short of miraculous. But for Peter, the act itself was enough. Violence had become his true form of release. It was at this time that Peter discovered that he gained pleasure from returning to the scene of his crimes. "The place where I attacked Kuhn I visited again that same evening twice and later several times," he said. On February 8, Peter strangled a 9-year-old girl named Rosa Olliger into unconsciousness before stabbing her in the stomach, temple, genitals, and heart with a pair of scissors, spontaneously ejaculating as he knifed the child. He then inserted his semen into her private part with his fingers. Peter then made a rudimentary effort to hide Rose's body by dragging it beneath a hedge before returning to the scene with a bottle of kerosene several hours later and setting the child's body on fire, achieving an orgasm at the sight of the flames. Rose's body was found beneath a hedge the following day. Rosa was just 9 years old. Her murder marked a turning point. Peter was no longer experimenting with violence. He was now fully consumed by it. Just 5 days later, on February 13, Peter murdered a 45-year-old mechanic named Rudolf Scheer in the suburb of Flingen Nord, stabbing him 20 times, particularly about the head, back, and eyes. Following the discovery of Scheer's body, Peter returned to the scene of the murder to converse with police, falsely informing one detective he had heard about the murder via telephone. This brazen act, standing among investigators, pretending to be a concerned citizen, revealed the depth of his arrogance. For Peter, the killings were not enough. He wanted to savor the chaos he created. Police were convinced they were looking for the same suspect in all these crimes, despite the fact that the victims ranged in sex and age. All the attacks had occurred in the Flingern district of Düsseldorf at around dusk, and all had received multiple stab wounds, likely with the same weapon. Investigators concluded that robbery had not been an obvious motive, and that the perpetrator was selecting his victims at random. For Düsseldorf police, this proved a bizarre and confusing factor in the crimes, and made the task more difficult in identifying such an abnormal criminal. The randomness was what terrified the city most. No one was safe, and anyone could be next. Although Peter did attempt to strangle 4 women between March and July 1929, one of whom he claimed to have thrown into the Rhine River, he is not known to have killed any further victims until August 11th, when he awarded, strangled, then repeatedly stabbed a young woman named Maria Hahn. Peter had first encountered Maria, whom he described as a girl looking for marriage, on August 8, and had arranged to take her on a date to the Neanderthal district of Düsseldorf the following Sunday. After several hours in Maria's company, Peter lured her into a meadow in order that he could kill her. He later admitted Maria had repeatedly pleaded with him to spare her life as he alternately strangled her, stabbed her in the chest and head, or sat astride her body, waiting for her to die. Maria's final moments were filled with terror and desperate pleas for mercy. For Peter, those pleas only heightened his cruelty. Approximately 1 hour after the attack, Maria died of her injuries. With his clothing bloodstained, worried that his wife might suspect him of the killing, he decided to hide Maria's body, burying it in a cornfield. Several weeks later, he returned with the intention of nailing the decomposing remains to a tree as part of a mock crucifixion that he wanted to shock and disgust the local community. However, the corpse proved too heavy for Peter to carry out his ghoulish plans. Instead, he returned her body to the grave, then embraced and caressed as he lay beneath the decomposing remains. He later admitted that before and after his attempted impalement of Maria's corpse, he had went to the grave many times and kept improving on it, and every time I thought of what was lying there and was filled with satisfaction. Maria was just a young woman looking for love. For her family, her disappearance was a tragedy. For Peter, it became an obsession he revisited again and again. Having seemingly gotten away with Maria's murder, Peter sent an anonymous letter to police in which he made a confession to her murder and directed investigators to her remains buried in the field, and also drew a crude map that described the location of the body. With the letter, police managed to locate Maria Hahn's remains on November 15, 1929. This taunting letter was Peter's way of playing with investigators. He wanted not only to kill, but to control the narrative of his crimes. Following Maria's murder, Peter changed his choice of weapon from scissors to a knife in an apparent effort to convince police more than one perpetrator was responsible for the unfolding crime spree. In the early morning of August 21, he randomly stabbed an 18-year-old girl, a 30-year-old man, and a 37-year-old woman in separate attacks. All 3 were seriously wounded, and all stated to police their assailant had not spoken a word to them before he had attacked them. The randomness of these attacks deepened the fear in Düsseldorf. No one could predict who would be next. 3 days later, at a fairground in the suburb of Flieh, Peter observed 2 foster sisters aged 5 and 14 walking from the fairground through adjoining allotments en route to their home. sending the older girl, Louise Lenzen, on an errand to purchase cigarettes for him upon the promise of being given 20 pfennig. Peter lifted the younger child, Gertrude Hamaker, off the ground by her neck and strangled her into unconsciousness before cutting her throat and discarding her body in a patch of runner beans. When Lenzen returned to the scene, Peter partially strangled her before stabbing her about the torso, with one wound piercing her aorta. He also bit and twice cut her throat before sucking blood from the wounds. Neither girl had been assayed, and the fact only Lenzen's footprints were found within 7 meters of her body suggests she may have attempted to flee from her attacker before collapsing. 2 innocent sisters, lured by trust and kindness, became victims of unimaginable cruelty. Their murders cemented Peter's reputation as a monster who preyed on the most vulnerable. The following day, Peter accosted a 27-year-old housemaid named Gertrude Schult, whom he demanded sex. She stared him down and said, "I would rather die." Enraged by her rejection, Peter shouted, "Well, die then," before repeatedly stabbing the woman in the head, neck, shoulder, and back. Schult survived her injuries. Although she was unable to provide investigators with a clear description of her assailant, she estimated his age to be around 40 and described him as a simple-looking man. Her defiance nearly cost her life, but it also revealed Peter's fragile ego. When denied, he lashed out with pure rage. Peter attempted to murder 2 further victims, one by strangulation, another by stabbing, in September, before opting to predominantly use a hammer in his murders. After these attempts, Peter decided to use a hammer in any subsequent attacks. Around this time, the press began referring to the unidentified killer as the Düsseldorf Monster or Vampire of Düsseldorf. The city was now gripped by hysteria. Newspapers sensationalized every detail, and the name, Vampire of Düsseldorf, spread fear far beyond Germany's borders. On the evening of September 30th, Peter encountered a 31-year-old servant girl named Ida Reuter at Düsseldorf Station. He successfully persuaded Reuter to accompany him to a cafe, and then for a walk through the local Hofgarten close to the Rhine River. At this location, he repeatedly struck her about the head with a hammer both before and after he had or worded her. At one stage in this assault, Reuter regained consciousness and began pleading with him to spare her life. In response, Peter simply gave her other hammer blows on the head and misused her. Ida's pleas, like Maria's before her, were met with merciless violence. For Peter, their suffering was part of the gratification. On October 11th, 11 days after Reuter's murder, Peter came across Elizabeth Dorier outside a theater. In a similar ploy with which he had lured Reuter, he persuaded the 22-year-old servant to go with him for a drink at a cafe, before taking a train to Grafenberg, where they would walk alongside the Klein-Dussel River. There he struck her across the head with a hammer, then worded her. Afterwards, the victim was hit several more times over the head and left for dead. Dorier was discovered at roughly 6:30 a.m. Left in a coma from the sustained and vicious attack, she died the following day from her injuries. Elizabeth's death marked yet another escalation. The Vampire of Düsseldorf was no longer just a shadowy figure. He was a relentless predator, and the city lived in constant dread of where he would strike next. On October 25th, Peter attacked 2 women with a hammer. Both survived, although in the second instance, this may have been because Peter's hammer broke in the attack. Even when his weapon failed, his intent was clear. Peter's violence was escalating, and survival often came down to chance. On November 7th, 1929, he encountered a 5-year-old girl named Gertrude Albermann in the Flingern district of Düsseldorf. He persuaded the child to accompany him to a section of deserted allotments, where he seized her by the throat and strangled her, stabbing her once in the left temple with a pair of scissors as per his modus operandi. When Albermann collapsed to the ground without a sound, Peter stabbed the child further 34 times in the temple and chest before placing her body in a pile of nettles close to a factory wall. Gertrude was only 5 years old. Her murder shocked even a city already living in fear. For investigators, it was proof that no one, not even the youngest and most innocent, was safe from the Vampire of Düsseldorf. By the late summer of 1929, the murders committed by the individual the press had dubbed the Vampire of Düsseldorf were receiving considerable national and international attention. Due to the sheer savagery of the murders, The diverse backgrounds of the victims, and the differing methods in which they had been assaulted and murdered, both the police and the press theorized the spate of assaults and murders were the work of more than one perpetrator. By the end of 1929, Düsseldorf police had received more than 13,000 letters from the public. With assistance from surrounding police forces, each lead was painstakingly pursued. As a result of this collective investigation into the killings, more than 9,000 individuals were interviewed, 2,650 other clues painstakingly pursued, and a list of 900,000 different names were compiled upon an official potential suspect list. The sheer scale of the investigation was unprecedented, but despite the scale of the investigation, the killer remained at large, his identity cloaked in shadows, his brutality escalating. The city of Düsseldorf braced itself for what would come next, unaware that the most chilling chapter was yet to unfold. On November 9, 1929, just 2 days after the brutal murder of young Gertrude, a local communist newspaper received a map revealing the location of Maria Hahn's grave. The crude drawing also revealed the precise location where he had left Albermann's body, which had been recovered earlier that day, described the exact position of her corpse, which could be found face down among bricks and rubble. This was not just confession, it was taunting. Peter wanted to control the fear, to orchestrate the city's horror like a conductor leading an orchestra of chaos. The letter underwent analysis by a handwriting expert, who stated his belief that the author was the same individual as the writer of the October letter. Each of the 3 letters sent to authorities and describing the crimes and threatening further assaults were examined by a graphologist, who confirmed they were written by the same individual. This revelation led Ernst Jennat, chief inspector of the Berlin police, to the conclusion that a single perpetrator was responsible for most, if not all, of the spate of assaults and murders. With this information, police doubled down on their effort to locate and apprehend the Düsseldorf vampire. The murder of Gertrude Albermann proved to be Peter's final fatal attack, although he did engage in a spate of non-fatal hammer attacks and attempted strangulations between February and May 1930, maiming 10 victims in these assaults. All the victims survived, and many were able to describe their attacker to the police. For the first time, survivors' voices began to pierce the fog of fear. Their testimonies gave investigators the clearest picture yet of the man who had terrorized Düsseldorf and brought them one step closer to unmasking the vampire. On May 14, 1930, an unknown man approached a 20-year-old woman named Maria Budlick at Düsseldorf Station. Discovering Maria had traveled to Düsseldorf from Köln in search of lodgings and employment, he offered to direct her towards a local hostel. Maria agreed to follow the man, although she became apprehensive when he attempted to lead her through a scarcely populated park. The pair began to argue, whereupon another man approached the two, asking whether Maria was being pestered by her companion. When Maria nodded, the man with whom she had been arguing simply walked away. The identity of the man who reportedly came to Budlick's aid was Peter Kürten. What seemed like a moment of rescue was, in fact, the beginning of her nightmare. Peter invited the distressed young woman to his apartment on Mettmannerstrasse to eat and drink before Maria, correctly deducing the underlying motive for Peter's hospitality, stated she was uninterested in engaging in sex with him. Peter calmly agreed and offered to lead Maria to a hotel, although he instead lured her into the Grafenboog woods, where he seized her by the throat and attempted to strangle her as he worded her. When Maria began to scream, Peter released his grasp on her throat before allowing her to leave. Maria Budlick survived, but her courage to later recount her ordeal would prove to be the key that unraveled the vampire's reign of terror. Maria did not report this assault to police, but described her ordeal in a letter to a friend, although she addressed the letter incorrectly. As such, the letter was opened at the post office by a clerk on May 19th. Upon reading the contents of the letter, this clerk forwarded the letter to the Düsseldorf police. This small accident of fate, a misaddressed letter, would become the turning point in one of the most notorious manhunts in German history. This letter was read by Chief Inspector Jennat, who assumed there was a slim chance Maria's assailant might be the Düsseldorf murderer. Jennat interviewed Maria, who recounted her ordeal, further divulging one of the reasons Peter had spared her was because she had falsely informed him she could not remember his address. She agreed to lead the police to Peter's home on Mettmannerstrasse. When the landlady of the property let Maria into the room of 71, Maria confirmed to Jeanette that this was the address of her assailant. The landlady confirmed to the chief inspector the tenant's name was Peter Kürten. Although Peter was not at home when Maria and Jeanette searched his property, he spotted the pair in the communal hallway and promptly left. Knowing that his identity was now known to the police, and suspecting they may also have connected him to the crimes committed by the vampire of Düsseldorf, Peter realized the mask had finally slipped. His double life, factory worker by day, predator by night, was collapsing. Upon the realization that his identity was known to police and capture was inevitable, Peter chose to explain the circumstances of the attack on Maria to his wife. Up to this point, nothing linked him to the crimes of the Düsseldorf vampire. However, the attempted SA of Maria, along with his previous crimes, could be enough to ensure 15 years of penal servitude. With his wife's consent, he rented a room in the Adlerstrasse district of Düsseldorf and did not return to his own home until May 23, 1930. He later described the events of Friday morning. "Today, the 23rd, in the morning, I told my wife that I was also responsible for the Schult affair, adding my usual remark that it would mean 10 years or more separation for us, probably forever. At that, my wife was inconsolable. She spoke of unemployment, lack of means, and starvation in old age. She raved that I should take my life. Then she would do the same, since her future was completely without hope. Then, in the late afternoon, I told my wife that I could help her." Peter decided to tell his wife everything, that he was the infamous Düsseldorf vampire, and disclosed to her every detail of the murders he had committed. For August Kürten, the revelation was shattering. The man she had lived beside for years was not just a criminal. He was the monster who had terrorized an entire city. Peter then hinted to his wife that a substantial reward had been offered in identifying and apprehending of the vampire, and that she could get hold of that money if she would report the confession and denounce him to the police. Peter later said, "Of course, it wasn't easy for me to convince her that this ought not to be considered as treason, but that, on the contrary, she was doing a good deed to humanity as well as to justice." It was not until late in the evening that she promised to carry out my request, and also that she would not commit suicide. It was 11 o'clock when we separated. Back in my lodging, I went to bed and fell asleep at once. On May 24, 1930, Peter's wife went to the police and told them everything she knew about her husband's crimes. Her decision was both an act of survival and of justice. By turning him in, she ended the reign of the vampire of Düsseldorf. She informed detectives that she had arranged to meet Peter outside St. Rochus Church at 3 o'clock that afternoon. At the appointed time, the whole area had been surrounded and 4 officers rushed forward with loaded revolvers the moment Peter appeared. The man suspected of being the Düsseldorf vampire simply smiled, telling the officers, "There is no need to be afraid," as he offered no resistance. The monster who had drenched a city in blood surrendered not with violence, but with a smile. Peter freely admitted his guilt in all the crimes police had attributed to the vampire of Düsseldorf, and further confessed he had committed the unsolved murder of Christine Klein and the attempted murder of Gertrude Franken in 1913. In total, Peter admitted to 68 crimes including 9 murders and 31 attempted murders. He made no attempt to excuse his crimes, but justified them on the basis of what he saw as the injustices he had endured throughout his life. Nonetheless, he was adamant he had not tortured any of his child victims. This attempt at distinction between murder and torture revealed the twisted logic he used to frame his own brutality. He also admitted to both investigators and psychiatrists that the sight of his victims' blood was, on many occasions, sufficient to bring him to orgasm, and that, on occasion, if he experienced ejaculation in the act of strangling a woman, he would immediately become apologetic to his victim, proclaiming, "That's what love is all about." He further claimed to have drunk the blood from the throat of one victim, from the temple of another, and to have licked the blood from a third victim's hands. In Maria's murder, he had drunk so much blood from the neck wound that he had vomited. He also admitted to having decapitated a swan in the spring of 1930 in order that he could drink the blood from the animal's neck, achieving ejaculation in the process. Even in his confessions, Peter blurred the line between violence and intimacy, revealing a psyche where cruelty and desire were inseparable. While awaiting trial, he spoke to Professor Karl Berg, an eminent German psychologist, providing, with remarkable frankness, an insight into his psychological perversity. Berg would later write the most comprehensive guide to the criminal career of Peter Kürten in a book entitled The Sadist. From the beginning of their interactions, Berg was successful in winning Peter's confidence, and their conversations provided a fascinating insight into the mind of a killer. Berg found that Peter's memory functioned with an almost photographic clarity, and he provided the most vivid details of each crime. He believed it provided a measure of the gratification of the act which Peter derived. When he spoke about matters that held little to no emotional value for him, Berg found that his memory was often highly defective and flawed. His obsession with murder, blood, and his own sexual gratification was paramount. What Berg and investigators found most astonishing was the manner in which Peter enumerated all his offenses. He was not accused of these crimes on a one-by-one basis, but rather reeled off his own account, beginning with his very first murder and ending with his 79th victim. Each of these cases were dictated to the stenographer, and Peter even showed a measure of satisfaction at the horrified faces of the many police officers that listened to his shocking recital. This confession made by Peter after his arrest at first generated some amount of doubt owing to the fullness and accuracy of the disclosure. However, the majority of these statements were later relayed to the examining magistrate. In response to this skepticism, Peter made sure he took time to describe each of the crimes with as much clarity as possible. Peter said, "It is very easy to describe crimes one has not committed. One could scarcely credit it that a confession could be founded on very full newspaper reports and yet be simply an invention. To that extent, I quite understand your doubts, Professor." Ultimately, his primary motivation in disclosing his crimes was to procure a lucrative future for his wife. Throughout the entirety of his confessions, it was noted the consistently high regard he paid towards his wife, and for Professor Berg, this was one of the most fascinating and contradictory aspects of his murderous persona. Despite the fact he had been unfaithful throughout his marriage, he still held an exceptional fondness for his wife and was desperate to ensure a substantial reward for her future years. Peter later said, "I had already finished with my life when I first knew the police were on my track. I wanted to fix up for my wife a carefree old age, for she is entitled to at least a part of the reward. That is why I entered a plea of guilty to all the crimes." Charged with a total of 9 murders and 7 attempted murders, Peter went to trial. Peter walked into the courtroom, calm, composed, almost eerily polite. He wore a dark suit, his posture upright, his gaze steady. No chains, no struggle, just a man who has confessed to unspeakable acts. The judge, Dr. Heuser, presides. The prosecution lays out the charges: 9 murders, 7 attempted murders. Each one brutal, each one deliberate. The courtroom gasps as the details unfold. Victims young and old, attacked with knives, hammers, even his bare hands. But Peter doesn't flinch. He listens, occasionally nodding, as if reviewing someone else's resume. His lawyers argue insanity. They paint Peter as a man tormented by sadistic urges, incapable of controlling his compulsions. They call psychiatrists to the stand. One describes him as a moral imbecile, another as a sexual psychopath driven by bloodlust. But the prosecution counters with chilling precision. Peter, they argue, knew exactly what he was doing. He chose his victims. He changed weapons. He evaded police for years. He even confessed in detail, sometimes with pride. Dr. Karl Berg, a leading psychiatrist, delivers the pivotal testimony. He is not psychotic. He is sane. He understands right from wrong. He simply does not care. The courtroom falls silent. Then Peter takes the stand. He speaks clearly, almost eloquently. He describes his crimes with disturbing calm. He admits to feeling pleasure, sexual pleasure, from the suffering of others. But he also says he wanted to be caught, that he confessed to end the torment. It's a performance that chills everyone present. Not because he's erratic, but because he's not. In answer to the judge's question as to whether he had a conscience, Peter replied, "I have none. Never have I felt any misgiving in my soul. Never did I think to myself that what I did was bad, even though human society condemns it. My blood and the blood of my victims will be on the heads of my torturers. There must be a higher being who gave in the first place the first vital spark to life. That higher being would deem my actions good since I revenged injustice. The punishments I have suffered have destroyed all my feelings as a human being. That was why I had no pity for my victims. In what was to become his trademark flat, unemotional voice, Peter described his life in which a combination of less than fortunate factors, heredity, upbringing, education, the faults of the German penal system, had all conspired to bring out and foster the latent sadistic streak with which Peter believed he had been born. The trial lasted 10 days. On April 22nd, the jury retired to consider their verdict. They deliberated for under 2 hours before reaching their verdict. Peter was found guilty and sentenced to death on 9 counts of murder. He was also found guilty of 7 counts of attempted murder. Peter displayed no emotion as the sentence was passed, although in his final address to the court, he stated that he now saw his crimes as being so ghastly that he did not want to make any sort of excuse for them. On the evening of July 1st, 1931, Peter Kürten, the Düsseldorf Vampire, received his last meal, ordering Wiener Schnitzel, a bottle of white wine, and fried potatoes. Upon eating the entire meal, he requested a second helping, with the prison staff granting his request. His execution was scheduled for 6 a.m. on July 2nd, 1931. A guillotine was erected in the yard of the Klingelputz prison, Cologne, and Peter walked unassisted, flanked by the prison psychiatrist and a priest, to where the executioner, Karl Groppler, stood waiting. Shortly before his head was placed on the guillotine, Peter turned to the prison psychiatrist and asked a question. "Tell me, after my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck?" He savored this thought for a while, then added, "That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." When asked whether he had any last words to say, Peter simply smiled and replied, "No." Following his death, Peter Kürten's head was taken to a lab for forensic analysis. But shockingly, scientists found no abnormalities in his brain. Today, the Düsseldorf Monster's eerily mummified head is on display at the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in Wisconsin. Peter Kürten didn't scream, didn't beg. He simply accepted his fate. But the real horror? He was sane, and that sanity made his crimes all the more terrifying. If this story made you think, hit like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more true crime told with depth and dignity. See you in the next case.